Julia Quinn glanced at the clock on the kitchen wall of the cozy suburban home, feeling a flutter of nervousness. It was her first evening babysitting for the Jenkins family, and although the 6-year-old she was watching, Max, was happily playing with his toys, Julia wanted everything to go smoothly. The cheerful hum of the neighborhood faded slightly as Julia made sure Max had his favorite snacks and books ready for the night. She smiled softly at the boy, who looked up with trust shining in his wide eyes. The sound of the front door opening broke the quiet. Mrs. Simmons, Max's mother, stepped in briskly, her expression tired and tense as she entered. Dressed in a sharply tailored jacket and carrying a leather briefcase, she looked every inch a busy professional. Her eyes quickly scanned the room, fixing on Julia as if sizing her up. Without warning, her voice cut through the calm. "Julia, honestly," she said sharply, "you forgot to bring the snacks I asked for. And what's with that baby monitor? You don't even know how to use it properly?" Julia's heart sank. She had tried her best, but the technology was new, and she hadn't realized the specific snacks were missing from the cupboard. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Simmons," Julia replied, her voice gentle but wavering slightly. "I'll make sure to get them before you return." Mrs. Simmons shook her head impatiently. "I don't think you're cut out for this. Honestly, it's like you don't understand what you're doing, dumb, really." Julia blinked, caught off guard. Max looked between them, confused. Mrs. Simmons straightened her jacket and rushed toward the door. "I'll be back soon. Don't mess things up before then," she snapped, leaving Julia standing alone, the weight of the insult heavy in the quiet house. Julia stood frozen for a moment after Mrs. Simmons's harsh exit, the harsh label, dumb, echoing in her mind like an unwelcome refrain. The kitchen felt suddenly colder, the cozy warmth she'd felt just moments ago replaced by a hollow ache in her chest. She glanced down at Max, his small face crumpled with confusion, eyes wide and unsure. He hadn't fully understood the words but felt the shift in the air, the tension that made his usual gleeful energy evaporate. "Max," Julia whispered softly, crouching to his level. "Let's try to focus on our game, okay?" She reached out to gather some of the scattered toys, hoping that redirecting his attention would keep the mood lighter. But her mind was still caught in the trap of Mrs. Simmons's criticism, each word slicing into her confidence. The front window caught the curious eyes of a few neighbors who happened to be out on their balconies or passing by. Some paused, their eyebrows knitting in concern as they overheard the brief but sharp exchange through the slightly open window. Julia felt their silent gazes weighing on her like an invisible audience quietly judging her. She tried to smile at them apologetically, but the discomfort only deepened. Just as she was trying to collect herself, the kitchen door opened again, this time revealing Mrs. Simmons's impatient return, which felt like a sudden gust of cold wind in the warm room. She didn't hesitate. "I said, this isn't working," she snapped, her eyes icy with disapproval. "I'm calling security to escort you out. This job is obviously beyond you." Julia's throat tightened. She wanted to protest, to explain that she was doing her best and that forgetting snacks was an honest mistake. But the words lodged painfully in her chest, overwhelmed by humiliation. "Mrs. Simmons, please," her voice cracked softly, "I just need a chance to make it right." "Chance? You had your chance. Now leave," Mrs. Simmons said sharply as she reached behind the doorway to press the security system call button installed on every room for emergencies. Her demeanor was unforgiving, as if this was a punishment rather than an inconvenience. Max whimpered softly, retreating behind Julia's legs, his little hands clutching her jeans tightly. Julia's heart broke watching him so vulnerable and frightened. "It's okay, Max," she crooned quietly, trying to shield him from the tension that twisted around them like a storm. Neighbors had now gathered outside the house in small groups, murmurs of concern and judgment rippling through the street. Julia had never felt so exposed. As a young woman who had spent years studying to work with children, to care for them genuinely, this public humiliation stung fiercely. One of the neighbors, a middle-aged woman named Elaine, approached the window and called gently, "Julia, we're just worried about what we heard. Are you okay?" Julia turned to the window, offering a weak smile. "I'm fine, thank you." But inside, she felt far from fine. Desperate to escape the oppressive atmosphere, she glanced at the front door, debating whether to quietly slip out and avoid further conflict. The idea of walking into the judgmental eyes of security, neighbors, and Mrs. Simmons was unbearable. Suddenly, from behind the crowd at the curb, a man stepped forward. He was in his 40s, dressed casually in a sweater, with a calm and kind expression that seemed to cut through the chilly tension. "I'm Thomas," he said as he opened the door gently, noticeably ignoring the arrival of security guards behind him. "I couldn't help but overhear. Julia, if you don't mind, may I come in?" Mrs. Simmons's eyes narrowed, clearly unhappy with this interruption, but the security guards hesitated, sensing the stranger's quiet authority. Thomas stepped inside with an easy confidence, his gaze softening when it rested on Julia. "You don't deserve this treatment," he said quietly, then knelt beside Max with a warm smile. The child immediately relaxed, captivated by the stranger's gentle manner. Julia's eyes flickered with surprise and relief. "Thank you," she whispered, still unsure of what to expect. Thomas addressed Mrs. Simmons, who crossed her arms defensively. "I'm an early childhood educator with over 15 years of experience. Judging someone's skill by a small mistake is unfair." Julia's calmness while handling Max, especially in this stressful moment, shows remarkable strength. Mrs. Simmons scoffed. "Strength? All I see is incompetence." Thomas shook his head. "No. I see patience, kindness, and genuine care. Julia's approach is exactly what children need, especially a child like Max, who thrives on stability and attention." Julia felt the warmth of Thomas's words seep into her, dissolving some of the harshness from before. She glanced down at Max, whose tears had stopped, replaced by a tentative smile as Thomas pulled out a small puzzle from his bag, letting the boy dive into a familiar game. More neighbors had now crowded near the windows, and a few were peeking through curtained glass, their expressions shifting from curiosity to admiration. Encouraged by Thomas's faith, Julia took a deep breath. "I'm trained in child psychology," she said softly, surprising even herself with the words. "I've volunteered at shelters, worked with children who need extra care. I just started babysitting to support my studies. I may not be perfect, but I care." Mrs. Simmons's eyes flickered with a mixture of disbelief and doubt. "Well, you should have said something." Julia shook her head. "I didn't want to seem like I was making excuses. I know I made mistakes, but I wanted to learn, to do better." Thomas smiled warmly at her. "That humility, Julia, paired with your patience, is rare. Let me suggest something." He turned to Max. "How about we try a storytelling game? Julia, you lead." Julia hesitated but then began weaving a tale with Max joining eagerly, her voice gaining strength and warmth. The story unfolded with magic and laughter, and the boy clapped joyfully, eyes sparkling. The neighbors, still watching, began to murmur their approval. Mrs. Simmons shifted uncomfortably as whispers of praise replaced the earlier judgment. The room seemed to brighten with the shift in energy, a quiet vindication blooming in the midst of the tension. Julia glanced around, realizing the tide had turned. From being the target of harsh words and suspicion, she was now the center of admiration. The neighbors whispered encouraging comments, and even the security guards relaxed their stance. Mrs. Simmons's lips pressed into a tight line. Julia could see for the first time the cracks in her confident armor. The woman who had so quickly dismissed Julia now found herself the subject of disapproving looks. Julia's cheeks still flushed from the earlier humiliation, but now there was a spark of pride kindling inside her. She had been judged unfairly, but she wasn't broken. The question lingering in the air was clear. What would she do next? Would she walk away quietly, or face the challenges ahead with newfound confidence? And what would Mrs. Simmons do as the walls she built of criticism began to crumble in the light of truth? Julia's hands trembled slightly as she gathered the scattered toys, her mind still racing from the intensity of the moment. The sudden arrival of Thomas, the stranger with the calm demeanor and kind eyes, had shifted the atmosphere in the room in ways she hadn't imagined possible just minutes before. She could feel the cautious curiosity of the neighbors pressing in through the windows and doorways, their earlier skepticism now replaced by something akin to surprise. Thomas bent down slowly to Max's level, smiling warmly. "I'm a child educator," he explained simply, "and I've seen many caregivers over the years. What I witnessed just now was patience and calmness under pressure, which is not common." Julia blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you," she murmured, her earlier doubts momentarily quieted. "I've been studying child psychology for years. Babysitting helps me practice, but you're right, I'm still learning." Thomas nodded. "May I?" he asked, indicating Max, who eagerly nodded back. He pulled from his bag an assortment of small props and began outlining a storytelling game, a simple, imaginative exercise that encouraged active participation and creativity. Julia wasn't sure she wanted to jump back into something so public, especially with Mrs. Simmons' sharp disapproval still fresh in the air. But as she watched Max's eyes light up with renewed joy and engagement, she felt a surge of determination. She could do this. She knew she could. "We can try a storytelling game," Julia said, her voice gaining strength. "Max, would you like that?" Max's nod was vigorous, and as Julia began weaving a tale about a brave fox exploring a moonlit forest, the child's laughter bubbled forth naturally. She invited Max to add to the story, to invent small details, and soon the room was filled with the joyous buzz of shared imagination. A few neighbors who had been silently watching whispered their delight. Mrs. Simmons, standing stiffly by the door, shifted uneasily. The realization seemed to dawn on her slowly, that Julia was not the incompetent caretaker she had dismissed so quickly. As Julia narrated, she seamlessly integrated playful lessons about kindness, courage, and problem-solving, demonstrating a nuanced understanding of child development. The story became a live illustration of the very principles she had studied but had been too nervous to assert earlier. When the story ended, the room was silent for a heartbeat, then filled with murmurs of appreciation and surprise. Thomas broke the silence. "Julia, may I ask how you came by your knowledge?" She hesitated, then spoke softly, "I'm finishing my degree in child psychology. I've volunteered extensively with children in shelters and after-school programs. Babysitting is new to me, I wanted the real-world experience." Mrs. Simmons's gaze lingered on her, less cold this time. "So your dress and lack of polish, well, it doesn't reflect your expertise." Julia smiled faintly, appreciating the insight. "I've been traveling from volunteer work to university. I didn't want to wear anything flashy, just what was practical." The neighbors exchanged glances, their earlier judgment fading at the revelation. Some nodded approvingly. Thomas added, "What you've shown tonight is not only skill but heart. That matters to any child." As the neighbors dispersed slowly, their expressions softened from skepticism to admiration. Mrs. Simmons approached Julia, the harsh lines of her face softened. "I should have given you time to show your capabilities. I was wrong to judge you so quickly." Julia met her eyes. "Thank you. I'm here for Max, and I want to earn your trust." Mrs. Simmons sighed, "Let's start over, then. Together." The moment blossomed with promise, a fragile but genuine foundation for future understanding. Julia felt the weight of the day lift a little, replaced by new hope. The child in her care smiled brightly, and for the first time that evening, she saw herself not as dumb or inadequate, but as someone capable, compassionate, and ready to grow. The day's trials had revealed her true talent, bringing surprise and respect to everyone around. The story had turned from one of judgment to one filled with potential, the power of kindness and knowledge shining through. As the evening settled into a gentle quiet, Julia found a moment to breathe deeply and reflect on the whirlwind of events that had unfolded in the Jenkins household. The once tense atmosphere had shifted, carrying with it a softness that allowed her true self to emerge, a self that had been quieted by circumstance and quick judgment. Julia's story was not one of glamour or privilege, but one rooted in resilience and purpose. She had grown up in a modest neighborhood, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a nurse who had always emphasized the value of kindness and education over appearances. From a young age, Julia was drawn to understanding how children learned and grew, their emotions and challenges shaping her passion for child psychology. Life had not made it easy. Financial constraints meant that Julia worked multiple part-time jobs to support her education, often foregoing luxuries to put herself through university. Her simple clothing and unpretentious demeanor were less about style and more a reflection of her focused priorities. Volunteering at local shelters had taken her far beyond the comfort zones of her daily routine, introducing her to the often overlooked struggles that so many children faced. Tonight, dressed simply in a worn sweater and jeans, she was far from the polished woman some in the neighborhood might expect in a childcare role. Yet beneath that unassuming exterior was a mind rich with knowledge and a heart full of dedication. She had come straight from a day of volunteering, her pockets filled with snacks and small toys collected for Max, hoping to create a nurturing space despite any obstacles. Mrs. Simmons's cold glance earlier in the evening had unsettled Julia, but now she understood the roots of the mother's disapproval, stress, exhaustion, and a deep desire to control what felt fragile in her busy life. Julia's calm presence offered a rare contrast, one that challenged preconceived notions of competency tied so closely to appearance. Max's laughter, dancing through the living room as he played beside Julia, was living proof of the connection she had woven with him. Her ability to engage him, to tap into his imagination without judgment or force, showed a professionalism that transcended the superficial. As Julia watched, Mrs. Simmons settled into a chair with a tentative smile, clearly reconsidering her earlier stance. She had seen firsthand Julia's patient guidance, the careful way she handled Max's whims and fears. There was respect now, softened, earned, and perhaps the beginning of trust. The neighbors who had lingered at the windows were now scattering, but their whispered praises still echoed faintly in the air. They had witnessed the unexpected transformation, a young woman underestimated and dismissed becoming the comforting presence the child needed. Julia's phone buzzed quietly in her pocket, breaking the reflective silence. It was a message from one of her closest friends, Lucy, who had always believed in Julia's potential even when others hadn't. "Keep your head up, Jules. You're better than they know. Proud of you." The words brought a smile to Julia's lips and warmth to her chest. She typed a quick reply, sharing the night's ordeal and unexpected turn. Lucy's immediate response offered an invitation to join a study group and a reminder that Julia's goals were within reach. The knowledge that she wasn't alone in her journey fortified Julia's resolve. She was much more than the hurried judgment passed by a stressed mother. She was a dedicated student, a compassionate volunteer, and above all, someone who truly cared for the children entrusted to her. As the clock ticked forward, Julia prepared to leave, gently packing Max's toys and straightening the room. Mrs. Simmons stood by the door now, the tension of earlier replaced with a hesitant warmth. "Thank you," Mrs. Simmons said softly. "For everything tonight. I'm sorry I doubted you." Julia smiled, a genuine beam that reached her eyes. "I understand. It's not easy to open up trust. I'm here to support Max in any way I can." Mrs. Simmons nodded, a small step toward partnership. "Let's find a way to work together, okay? For Max." Julia's heart lifted. "Absolutely." Leaving the house, Julia stepped into the cool night air with a sense of quiet triumph. Her footsteps felt lighter, her spirit stronger. She was still the same woman who had arrived uncertain and underprepared in the eyes of some, but now she also carried a spark of confidence, a testament to her knowledge, kindness, and resilience. The experience had stripped away assumptions and revealed a truth far richer than appearances could convey. Julia Quinn was not dumb. She was capable, compassionate, and determined to make a difference in the lives of children like Max. One story, one moment, one laugh at a time. As she walked down the familiar streets toward home and her future, Julia's thoughts drifted to what awaited her academic journey and the many children she would impact along the way. This night was but a stepping stone, a quiet victory in her unfolding story. The understanding that she need not prove herself to every skeptic, but only to remain true to her convictions, settled deeply within her. Julia knew her worth, and with that knowledge, she embraced the promise of growth and new opportunities ahead. The next morning, the atmosphere in the neighborhood was noticeably different. Word of the previous evening's events had made its way around quietly but decisively. Where judgment and skepticism once lingered like a heavy fog, a sense of respect and understanding now took root. Julia sensed the change as she walked down the familiar streets toward the Jenkins house, her steps steady, her heart resolute. As she reached the front steps, Mrs. Simmons was waiting, her expression more composed than the night before. The tension from their earlier confrontation had softened into something more reflective, a recognition of misjudgments not just about Julia, but perhaps about herself as well. "Julia," Mrs. Simmons began cautiously, "I want to apologize again. My words were harsh, and I realize I unfairly put you in a difficult place." She paused, seeming to weigh her next words carefully. "To make up for it, I'd like to offer you compensation for your time and effort, more than the usual rate, actually." Julia hesitated for a moment, the offer stirring unexpected feelings. She had never pursued a job for money alone. Her motivation had always been to learn, to grow, and to make a difference. But the sincerity in Mrs. Simmons's tone suggested this was less about pay and more about making amends. "Thank you," Julia said softly. "I appreciate that very much. But what matters most to me is working together for Max's well-being." Mrs. Simmons nodded, relief flickering in her eyes. "Agreed. Let's find a way to be partners in this." With the ice broken, Julia found herself welcomed more genuinely into the household. Her relationship with Mrs. Simmons, once fraught with misunderstanding, began to evolve into one of mutual respect. Julia's dedication to Max was evident each day, and Mrs. Simmons often sought her advice, showing a willingness to trust in Julia's insights. The neighbors, too, started to look at Julia differently. Conversations about the babysitter who had been underestimated shifted to praise for her patience, knowledge, and warmth. Elaine, the middle-aged neighbor from across the street, stopped Julia one afternoon with a kind smile. "You handled yourself admirably that night, Julia. It takes courage and grace." Julia returned the smile, feeling a flush of gratitude. "Thank you, Elaine. It means a lot." Even the security guards who had been called the night before gave quick nods of greeting, their attitudes softened by the events they'd witnessed. Over the following weeks, Julia's life began to intertwine more fully with both the Jenkins family and her own aspirations. She enrolled in additional practical childcare workshops, bolstered by a sense of validation and renewed confidence. Thomas, the educator who had stepped into the tense situation, reached out to invite Julia to assist with community programs, recognizing her talent and eagerness. One afternoon at the community center, Julia found herself surrounded by children engaged in creative crafts and lively games. The energy was contagious. Watching the bright faces and hearing their infectious laughter, Julia felt the deep satisfaction that came from serving in a role that resonated with her core. This was her calling. Back at her modest apartment, Julia kept in close touch with Lucy, whose unwavering support provided a steady balance to the busyness of her studies and work. Their conversations often circled back to the evening with Mrs. Simmons and Max, a defining moment that underscored Julia's journey from doubt to self-assurance. Mrs. Simmons's own transformation was quietly profound. The relentless pressure she had felt began to ease as she allowed herself to accept help and embrace a more collaborative approach in parenting and life. She found unexpected value in Julia's insights, not just as a babysitter but as a thoughtful partner in raising Max. The day finally came when Mrs. Simmons publicly acknowledged the changes within herself and the household. At a neighborhood meeting, she spoke with candor. "I was wrong to judge Julia as I did. Her dedication and expertise have been invaluable to our family. Sometimes, the hardest lessons come from looking beyond appearances." A chorus of nods and supportive words greeted her statement. Julia, sitting quietly among the attendees, felt a swell of pride and humility. The path had not been easy, but the resolution was authentic and rewarding. Later that evening, as Julia put Max to bed with the same gentle care she had always extended, Mrs. Simmons stood nearby watching, a new warmth in her eyes. "Thank you, Julia," she whispered. "For your patience, your kindness, and for reminding me what really matters." Julia smiled, her heart full. "It's a partnership. We're both learning." Max yawned widely, snuggling into his bed with a contented sigh. Julia watched him, the boy's peacefulness a powerful reminder of why she persevered. As she left the house that night, Julia felt a sense of closure and new beginnings intertwined. The sharp sting of earlier judgment had given way to acceptance and respect. Hers was a story not just of vindication but of growth and connection. Before stepping into the quiet street, Julia turned back briefly to the illuminated windows of the Jenkins home. The sight of Max, now happy and secure, was the real reward beyond words or gestures. The story invited reflection. What would you have done in Julia's place when faced with unfair criticism? How might kindness and courage change the outcome? If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Every story we share is a chance to understand each other just a little better. See you in our next story.